It began on a quiet street at the edge of a small, picturesque community named Maple Ridge Estates. The neighborhood sat on a hill that overlooked a wide valley, a view that could stop anyone in their tracks. The sunsets there weren't just beautiful, they were breathtaking. Every evening, the sky painted itself in shades of gold, crimson and lavender, washing the valley in color until darkness took over. For years, that view had been the pride of every homeowner along the ridge, especially for one man named Daniel Brooks. Daniel had moved into his dream home 3 years earlier, after saving for nearly a decade. The backyard deck was his sanctuary, a place where he'd sip coffee in the mornings and unwind in the evenings. It wasn't extravagant, but the view made it priceless. He often said it was like owning a front row seat to nature's grand performance. But peace in a perfect neighborhood never lasts long, especially when there's a Karen next door. Her name was Linda Thornton, though everyone in Maple Ridge called her the Queen of Complaints. She was the self-appointed guardian of the HOA's image, the kind of neighbor who saw violations in perfectly trimmed lawns and conspiracies in misplaced trash cans. Her yard was flawless, her hedges geometrically precise, and her nose perpetually tilted just high enough to look down on everyone else. At first, she ignored Daniel. He was quiet, polite, and never caused trouble. But one afternoon, everything changed. It started with a rumor that Linda was planning to add a privacy structure in her backyard. Most thought it meant a small lattice fence or a few tall shrubs. But when the construction trucks showed up, it was clear she had other intentions. By the end of the week, massive wooden beams rose from her property line like a fortress wall. Daniel didn't think much of it at first, assuming it would stop at a reasonable height. But when the panels kept going higher, blocking more and more of the valley view, concern turned into disbelief. From his deck, Daniel could no longer see the horizon. The golden sunsets that had once poured across his yard were now reduced to dull strips of light between the wooden planks. What used to be a wide, open view had become a claustrophobic wall. Neighbors noticed, too. The talk spread quickly through the community. Linda was building what locals sarcastically called the Great Wall of Maple Ridge. It turned out she'd applied for a privacy structure permit but conveniently failed to mention that it would be over 15 feet high, far beyond what the HOA allowed. When confronted at a board meeting, she argued it was for personal peace and aesthetic protection. Daniel tried to reason through official channels. He filed a polite complaint, hoping the HOA would see reason. But Linda was well connected. She'd been on the board for years, and her influence was strong. When the ruling came back, it wasn't in Daniel's favor. The HOA claimed her structure was within special exemption status, a rule that seemed invented overnight. The situation left Daniel furious, but not reckless. He wasn't the kind of man to shout or make a scene. Instead, he took quiet walks along his yard, staring at the wall that now loomed where the sun once set, and he thought. He thought about fairness, pride, and how one person's selfishness could poison something beautiful. The days grew longer, and the summer heat pressed down. The wooden wall warped slightly in the sun, but Linda didn't care. She'd even painted it a pale beige, calling it neutral and tasteful, though most neighbors described it as bland and smug. As time went on, something began to shift in Daniel. The bitterness didn't consume him. It focused him. If she wanted to block his view, fine. But he wasn't going to surrender the peace he had worked so hard for. He started looking through property listings in his spare time, mostly to distract himself. One evening, purely out of curiosity, he pulled up the local real estate site and filtered the search to show nearby listings. That's when his eyes froze on something impossible. Linda's house. It was listed. Quietly, discreetly, but unmistakably hers. The price was high but not unreachable. And more importantly, the note said, owner seeking fast sale due to out-of-state relocation. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. He thought about all the nights she'd ruined, all the petty notes she'd left about Cho's standards, all the peace she'd stolen with her towering wall. And now, by some twist of fate, she was selling the very fortress she'd built to torment him. He didn't tell anyone. Not his friends, not the neighbors, not even his family. Over the next week, he quietly gathered paperwork, contacted his bank, and arranged a viewing through an agent who didn't even know the history between them. When he stepped into Linda's house for the first time, he almost laughed. The interior was immaculate but sterile, like a museum of rules. Everything was symmetrical, labeled perfect. And through the back windows, he could see it. That same massive wall, now from the opposite side. It looked even uglier from there. The agent spoke about potential, about resale value, about neighborhood reputation. Daniel barely listened. He knew exactly what he was going to do. A few days later, his offer went through. It wasn't the highest bid, but it was clean, fast, and without contingencies. Exactly what a seller in a hurry wanted. When the call came confirming the sale, Daniel felt something powerful wash over him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was justice, quiet, poetic, and absolute. He didn't brag. He didn't post about it online. He simply waited for the day of closing, signed the papers, and received the keys. Linda, unaware of who the buyer was, completed her move a week later. The last time she drove down the street, she didn't even glance at Daniel's house. She had no idea what was coming. And when her moving truck disappeared over the hill, Daniel walked over to his new property, stood in the backyard, and stared at the wall she'd built, his wall now. The view beyond it was still hidden, but in that moment, Daniel realized something. Sometimes, to reclaim your peace, you don't fight your enemies. You just buy their house. And this was only the beginning. Ownership came with a strange silence. When Daniel signed the final documents and officially took possession of Linda Thornton's home, there wasn't a sense of triumph, just stillness. The kind that followed a long, drawn-out storm. The neighbors didn't know yet. Most thought Linda had simply relocated for work, and no one had connected the dots. Daniel waited a few days before making any moves. He wanted to step carefully. On the surface, he was now just a man who owned two adjacent properties. One his home, and the other an investment. That was the word he used when anyone asked. He was investing. And technically, he wasn't lying. But deep down, he knew what this was. This wasn't about money. This was about peace, and the quiet satisfaction of righting a wrong without ever raising his voice. The first time he walked through the house alone, it still carried Linda's energy. The faint smell of her floral cleaner lingered in the air, and everything was organized to an obsessive degree. The curtains were closed, the thermostat set precisely to 72 degrees, and even the shelves were alphabetized. It was eerie, like walking through the shell of control itself. He didn't rush to move anything. Instead, he stood in the living room, looking out the back window toward that massive wall. It dominated the yard, a monument to vanity and ego. From this side, he could see all its imperfections. The warped boards, the uneven paint, the cracks forming where the nails had split the wood. It wasn't a wall built for peace. It was a wall built for spite. A week later, the neighborhood started to notice a few subtle changes. The once perfect lawn was being reseeded with native grass. The shutters were repainted a warmer tone. The stiff, lifeless garden beds were replaced with wildflowers. To outsiders, it looked like the new owner was simply modernizing. To Daniel, it was a slow exorcism, stripping away every piece of Linda's suffocating legacy. Then came the day he had been waiting for. Early on a Saturday morning, a small demolition crew arrived. They parked quietly, greeted him politely, and waited for instructions. Daniel handed them the paperwork and pointed toward the structure in the backyard. The foreman nodded once, understanding everything without needing to ask. The sound of the first hammer hitting wood echoed through the neighborhood like a thunderclap. Curtains twitched, garage doors cracked open. People peeked out from behind blinds, curious and cautious. The noise grew louder, sharp, rhythmic strikes cutting through the air. By noon, half of the wall was gone. The sunlight poured through for the first time in months, washing over Daniel's yard like a long-lost friend. Dust rose in golden waves, and with each section that fell, the valley view began to return. It wasn't just a physical change. It was emotional. The suffocating pressure that had hung over him for so long began to lift. Some neighbors walked over, pretending to make small talk but clearly eager to know what was going on. Daniel kept his responses vague. Just clearing out an old structure, he'd say, though he could see their smiles of quiet approval. Everyone knew what that wall had represented. By evening, only a pile of splintered wood remained. The open sky stretched wide and brilliant above him, the sun setting in full view for the first time in nearly a year. The horizon burned orange and pink, and for a moment, Daniel simply stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing it in. It was freedom, the simplest, most profound kind. But while the wall was gone, the story wasn't finished. News of the demolition reached further than he expected. The HOA board, once firmly under Linda's control, called an emergency meeting to review potential violations regarding structural removal. It was almost poetic. The same board that had bent the rules for her was now twisting them against him. Daniel didn't panic. He showed up at the meeting with every document in hand. The deed, the contractor's permit, the structural reports, and the HOA's own bylaw copies. He sat quietly through the posturing, through the passive-aggressive remarks about community consistency. And when they finally demanded clarification, he provided it with calm precision. The structure had been unapproved beyond its permitted height. It violated setback codes. It had been constructed without the full HOA inspection required under their own guidelines. And since he was now the owner of the property, he was fully within his rights to remove any unapproved or unsafe structure. Silence filled the room. For the first time, the HOA realized they were not dealing with another easily intimidated homeowner. That night, when Daniel returned home, the stars were visible again, sharp and clear above the valley. He leaned on his deck railing, gazing out at the view that had once been stolen. The soft hum of cicadas filled the air, and a cool breeze drifted through the open space where the wall had stood. It was over, at least that part of it. But Maple Ridge Estates had a way of holding grudges, and not everyone was pleased by the balance shifting. The next morning, anonymous letters began appearing in mailboxes, whispering about favoritism, about rule, bending, about a man who thought he was above the community. Daniel didn't have to guess where it came from. Even gone, Linda's influence still echoed through her old allies on the board. They resented the change, resented the light returning to the neighborhood. Power, once lost, never disappears quietly. Still, Daniel refused to engage. Instead, he doubled down on his quiet project. He began renovating the interior of the house, one room at a time, transforming it from a shrine of control into a place of comfort. He opened the curtains wide, installed large glass doors facing the valley, and painted the walls in warm, inviting colors. The house that once symbolized division was becoming something new, something open. By late autumn, the two properties looked like one continuous space. The yards flowed together naturally, joined by a shared garden and a winding stone path. When the leaves fell, the valley stretched out below like a golden tapestry, unbroken and whole again. Neighbors began to stop by, often just to say how beautiful it looked. Some admitted they'd been scared to stand up to Linda before. Others simply thanked him for restoring the view everyone had missed. And as word spread that he was the one who'd bought her house, the whispers began to shift from gossip to admiration. What had started as a petty neighborhood feud was quickly turning into a story, one of poetic justice, quiet revenge, and balance restored. But as Daniel would soon learn, peace in Maple Ridge never lasted long, because while he was rebuilding, someone else had plans to tear it all down again. The winter months in Maple Ridge brought stillness, the kind that settled deep into the streets and houses, muffling everything under a blanket of frost. For a while, Daniel thought the storm had passed. The feud was over, the wall was gone, and his peace had been restored. But in neighborhoods like Maple Ridge, peace rarely meant the end. It only meant the calm before something new began. After Linda's sudden move, the HOA had struggled to keep order. Her allies on the board were directionless without her, arguing among themselves about rules and responsibilities. Meetings were tense and unproductive, with homeowners losing patience at the bureaucracy that Linda had built. In the middle of it all, Daniel found himself becoming a silent figure of influence. He never asked for power, but his quiet defiance had earned respect. People saw him as the man who'd stood up against the system, someone who had exposed its cracks without shouting. His name carried weight now, not because of authority, but because of example. Still, not everyone saw it that way. Some believed he had humiliated the board, that he had undermined the HOA's control by buying Linda's house and tearing down her infamous wall. To them, Daniel represented rebellion, a dangerous precedent for a neighborhood built on order. It wasn't long before the pushback began. At first, it came in small ways. Notices about maintenance standards left in his mailbox, each citing some obscure bylaw. One week it was about his driveway being too faded, the next, a complaint about the unauthorized garden extension. They were all baseless, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted him back in line. He didn't react. He paid no fines, made no public statements, and gave them nothing to use against him. Instead, he kept renovating. The two properties were slowly merging into one harmonious space, The kind of home that made people stop and stare. The deck overlooked the valley perfectly now, and from the right angle, it seemed like the house floated above the hills. And that view, the very view that had started everything, had never looked better. But someone couldn't stand it. It began with rumors. A few board members quietly suggested that owning 2 adjoining lots violated the spirit of the community design. Then, without warning, a letter arrived. It was thick, formal, stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a notice of review, a hearing to evaluate potential misuse of property for non-residential purposes. They were accusing Daniel of running a commercial operation. The reasoning: the construction traffic, landscaping trucks, and frequent deliveries for his renovations. It was absurd, but calculated. They wanted to tie him up in hearings, paperwork, and threats until he gave up. The hearing was set for early spring. When the day came, Daniel arrived prepared. He knew their tactics now: vague accusations, emotional manipulation, and invented interpretations of rules. But what he didn't expect was who sat at the head of the board that morning. Linda Thornton. She was back. Not as a homeowner, but as a consultant. After selling her property and leaving town, she had apparently convinced the board that her expertise was needed to restore order. She sat there like a ghost returned from the past, calm, composed, and smiling with quiet satisfaction. The moment he saw her, Daniel understood. The letters, the notices, the sudden scrutiny. It had all been her doing, orchestrated from behind the scenes. The hearing dragged on for hours. The accusations were hollow, but the tone was relentless. They tried to make him appear defiant, reckless, uncooperative. But Daniel had learned their language. He countered every claim with evidence, every insinuation with documentation. He remained calm, his composure sharper than their collective arrogance. By the end, the board had nothing left. The case was dismissed, but the damage was done. The neighborhood was split. Some saw the hearing as a witch hunt, others as a necessary stand against home-controlled homeowners. And through it all, Linda was rebuilding her influence. She bought a smaller property on the opposite side of the ridge, high enough to see his home from her new deck. She began attending HOA events again, slowly regaining the loyalty of her old circle. It was subtle but deliberate, like ivy growing back over a once cleared wall. Soon, whispers started circulating that Daniel's renovations were changing the character of the neighborhood, that his merging of properties would lower surrounding values. It didn't matter that his improvements had raised the overall appeal. Perception was everything, and Linda knew exactly how to poison it. Still, Daniel stayed silent. He had something stronger than gossip: time, patience, and ownership. That spring he finalized the landscaping on both lots. A seamless garden connected the homes, lined with cedar trees and soft lighting. The properties no longer looked like 2 separate houses. They had become a single, breathtaking estate overlooking the valley. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was elegant, balanced. Even those who disliked him couldn't deny its beauty. But the real masterpiece was what he did next. He opened the property for a local charity event, a community art fair, free to attend, with proceeds going to the town's animal shelter. Dozens of families came. Kids ran across the lawn, artists displayed their work, and for one day the tension melted away. The HOA had no grounds to object. It was a nonprofit event, fully compliant with regulations. It was a masterstroke. The same people who had once criticized him now praised his generosity. News coverage followed. Pictures of the event appeared online, showing the breathtaking backdrop of the valley, the gardens, and the open space that had replaced Linda's wall. The community loved it, and that infuriated Linda more than anything. She had spent years building power through control, while Daniel had gained it through grace. No manipulation, no threats, just quiet integrity. And now, the same neighbors who had once feared her whispered admiration for him. But power never dies quietly. It clings, fights, and corrupts. Linda wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Behind closed doors, she began gathering signatures, drafting amendments, and skimming new restrictions. She told her supporters it was about protecting the community's integrity, but everyone knew who it was really about. Daniel's success had become her obsession. The wall was gone, but a new kind of barrier was being built, one made not of wood, but of politics, resentment, and control. And soon, it would come crashing down in ways no one could have predicted. By the time summer returned to Maple Ridge, the air itself seemed thicker, heavy with unspoken tension. The valley shimmered under the heat, and the hills that once felt peaceful now carried the weight of invisible battles. The community looked the same on the surface: manicured lawns, neat driveways, and blooming gardens. But beneath it all, quiet rivalries were hardening into something colder. At the center of it stood two names: Daniel Brooks and Linda Thornton. Daniel had become a quiet legend among the residents. His estate, the merged property that had once been two homes, had become a symbol of calm defiance. People admired it, even envied it. But for Linda, it was a constant reminder of humiliation. Every time she glanced across the ridge and saw his open view, she saw her own downfall staring back. And so, she began her next move. It started innocently enough. A new proposal appeared on the HOA agenda, a Property Preservation and Aesthetic Standards Amendment. The language was vague but wrapped in professional phrasing about maintaining community cohesion and preventing unregulated property expansion. Most people didn't think much of it at first, but Daniel knew exactly what it was. The amendment, if passed, would retroactively limit the size of merged properties within the neighborhood and require any dual lot ownership to be split or sold. It was, in every sense, a direct attack on him, hidden behind a wall of bureaucratic jargon. But Linda was smart. She didn't present it as a vendetta. She presented it as protection against overdevelopment and loss of neighborhood charm. She whispered to her allies that Daniel's estate would attract investors, that outsiders would come, that it was the beginning of Maple Ridge losing its exclusivity. And one by one, they began to believe her. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, each written in polished language about preserving community values. Some residents signed the petition without reading it. Others did it out of fear, unsure what would happen if they didn't. And for those who resisted, Linda paid visits in person, smiling, persuasive, relentless. Daniel heard about the petition before it reached his door. Neighbors warned him quietly, apologetically. They liked him, they respected him, but they were afraid of crossing the board. Still, he refused to play her game. He didn't go door to defend himself. He didn't send counter flyers or hold meetings. He stayed calm, watched, and waited, because he knew that patience, once again, would be his greatest weapon. But patience didn't stop the gossip. Some began whispering that Daniel was planning to rent out one of his houses as a luxury Airbnb. Others claimed he had built illegal structures on his property. None of it was true, but truth mattered little in Maple Ridge. Perception ruled everything. When the HOA announced the date of the vote, the tension broke through the calm facade. It was set for a Thursday evening, a special session that would decide the future of his estate. The days leading up to it were suffocating. Daniel continued with his life as if nothing had changed. He tended to his garden, worked on small home projects, and greeted his neighbors with his usual easy politeness. But beneath that calm exterior, every move was calculated. He was preparing, quietly gathering his own evidence, documents, and allies. He didn't plan to argue emotionally. He planned to dismantle the entire amendment piece by piece. The night of the vote arrived hot and thick with summer humidity. Cars lined both sides of the street as homeowners filed into the community center. The atmosphere inside buzzed with low murmurs and tension. The board sat at the front, with Linda positioned beside them, smiling faintly like a queen returned to her throne. The meeting began in order, with the usual pleasantries and procedural formalities. But when the Property Preservation Amendment came up, the room shifted. Everyone knew why they were there. Linda presented first. Her tone was smooth, rehearsed, and dripping with moral justification. She spoke about protecting the neighborhood's visual integrity and ensuring no single homeowner could monopolize scenic views or common aesthetics. Her words were sharp enough to wound but polished enough to pass as reason. When she finished, a few people clapped politely. Others stayed silent. Then Daniel stood. He walked to the front with a folder in his hand, no anger in his step, no bitterness in his voice, just calm, deliberate certainty. He began by reading the HOA's own charter, word for word, reminding everyone that the organization's mission was to serve the collective interest of residents, not individual vendettas. He then produced property valuation reports, showing that his combined lots had increased neighborhood property values by 15% since the merger. He showed community event records, proof that his open space had hosted public functions, improved engagement, and brought positive attention to Maple Ridge. And then, with perfect precision, he revealed a letter. It was a legal notice from the county zoning department. confirming that his property merger had been fully approved and documented long before the HOA's new proposal was even drafted. Any retroactive regulation against it, the letter stated, would constitute a violation of state property law. The room went silent. Even those loyal to Linda glanced at each other, uneasy. The weight of legality was something none of them wanted to challenge. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply handed copies of the documents to the board and walked back to his seat. The vote proceeded, and the amendment failed by a narrow margin. For the first time, Linda's power slipped. That night, as people left the meeting, Daniel noticed something different in their faces. Some smiled at him for the first time. Others avoided eye contact, embarrassed at having been manipulated. And though Linda stayed composed, her composure was brittle, cracking under the quiet realization that she had lost again. But victory came with a cost. The battle had reopened old wounds in the community. Neighbors divided further, taking sides even when they didn't want to. The sense of unity that once defined Maple Ridge was crumbling, replaced by subtle resentment and tension. Daniel had won the vote, but Linda wasn't finished. Defeat only fueled her obsession. She retreated into the shadows, her social presence disappearing almost overnight. But those who knew her best recognized that silence for what it was, the quiet before another storm. And sure enough, whispers began circulating weeks later. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint with the county about potential zoning violations related to his renovations. County inspectors were coming. It was happening again. Only this time, Linda wasn't playing within the HOA's walls. She was taking the fight beyond them. And Daniel knew this next battle wouldn't be fought in meetings or polite discussions. It would be fought in paperwork, inspections, and court filings. The war for Maple Ridge had just entered its next phase. The morning the inspectors arrived, the neighborhood felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but tense, expectant, like the whole street was holding its breath. 2 white SUVs rolled slowly up the hill toward Daniel's property. Their official county seals gleamed faintly in the sunlight. Behind curtains and blinds, curious eyes watched. They always did. Maple Ridge had become a stage, and everyone loved a good performance, especially when it wasn't theirs. Daniel stood on his front porch as the vehicles came to a stop. He already knew why they were here. The anonymous complaint had been predictable, almost formulaic, claims of unauthorized construction, unpermitted plumbing, and possible environmental violations due to runoff from his hillside property. It was Linda's handiwork, written not in her handwriting but in her style, precise, venomous, self-righteous. The inspectors were polite but efficient. They had a checklist, a mandate, and the kind of procedural detachment that comes with bureaucracy. Daniel let them through the gate and watched as they moved methodically across the grounds. Measuring, photographing, and scribbling notes, they examined everything, the terraces, the retaining walls, even the new solar panels installed along the slope. Each moment stretched painfully long. Neighbors pretended to be gardening or washing cars, sneaking glances over hedges. The HOA president himself wandered outside for a walk, pacing slowly past the property like a spectator waiting for a verdict. For 3 hours, the inspection dragged on, and through it all, Daniel remained calm, because he'd expected this exact move. He'd spent weeks preparing, collecting every permit, receipt, and engineer certification. He had nothing to hide, but he knew that wasn't the point. The point was humiliation. Linda wanted a scene, and she was getting one. When the inspectors finally left, their expressions unreadable, the silence that followed was almost deafening. Daniel watched their vehicles disappear down the street, leaving behind a faint trail of dust and tension. By evening, the gossip machine had already restarted. Some said he'd been caught violating zoning laws. Others claimed the county was ordering demolition. None of it was true, but truth had long since become irrelevant in Maple Ridge. Days passed before the report arrived. It was clean. Perfectly clean. Every structure, every addition, every modification, fully compliant. The inspectors even noted that the property's runoff management was among the best in the entire neighborhood. Daniel read the report slowly, a quiet satisfaction building in his chest. It wasn't joy exactly. It was vindication, silent and solid. Proof that patience, planning, and composure would always cut deeper than anger. But the report did more than clear his name. It shifted the balance again. For months, residents had whispered doubts about him. Now, those same residents began whispering about Linda. They remembered her campaign, her petition, her obsessive attempts to protect the neighborhood. They remembered how each effort mysteriously targeted Daniel, and how each one failed. And slowly, the tide began to turn. It started with small things. Invitations to HOA events returned. Neighbors who once avoided him now waved again. Even the HOA board, embarrassed by how much time and money they'd wasted on baseless disputes, began quietly distancing themselves from Linda. But she didn't vanish. If anything, she doubled down. A week after the inspection report was finalized, a "for sale" sign appeared, right in front of Linda's house. At first, no one believed it. She'd lived there for nearly 2 decades, her pride and her anchor. The idea that she'd give it up seemed impossible. But as the days went by, the sign stayed. And behind her blinds, her house remained dark. It wasn't defeat that drove her decision. It was strategy. She wasn't leaving Maple Ridge. She was repositioning. Through quiet channels, she arranged to move temporarily, renting a smaller property 2 streets over. Her plan was simple: remove herself from the chaos she'd created, wait until Daniel let his guard down, and find a new way to strike from a distance. But Daniel didn't relax. If the last year had taught him anything, it was that peace in Maple Ridge was an illusion, a fragile shell that cracked easily under pride. So instead of celebrating, he began preparing for what came next. He expanded his property's landscaping, planting tall evergreens along the outer boundary. He upgraded the fencing, not as an act of isolation, but as protection. He even installed motion-sensitive lighting, practical measures disguised as aesthetic improvements. Each project made his home stronger, safer, more permanent. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was changing. The never-ending drama between Daniel and Linda had drawn attention from beyond the gates. Local realtors started using the phrase, the Ridgeview Homes, in listings, referring to properties near Daniel's open vista. What had once been a small, quiet community was becoming a sought-after address. Ironically, Linda's obsession had made the man she despised the face of the neighborhood's success. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Weeks later, a letter arrived in Daniel's mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA, it wasn't from the county. It was from a real estate firm, the same one managing the sale of Linda's house. Inside was an offer. A simple, typed letter stating that the property next door was officially on the market. And that, as a neighboring homeowner, Daniel had the right to make a first offer before it went public. He read it twice, slowly. For a long moment, he stood on his porch, looking across the boundary at the empty house that had once belonged to Linda Thornton. The same house she had used as a weapon, blocking his view, filing complaints, spreading rumors. And now it was his for the taking. The symmetry of it all felt poetic. Not revenge, just balance. He didn't rush. He didn't boast. He simply called his lawyer, made inquiries, and began the process quietly. Behind closed doors, the negotiations began. It took weeks. Papers, signatures, escrow delays, and countless phone calls. But when the final documents were signed, the deed transferred. The property that had once symbolized hostility now belonged to the man she'd tried so hard to destroy. Linda didn't attend the closing. She didn't need to. She already knew. That night, Daniel walked to the edge of his now expanded property. The view stretched unbroken. Across the hills, the valley, the horizon glowing faintly under the setting sun. He stood there for a long time, not in triumph, but in reflection. The war was over. Or so he thought. Because somewhere in town, in a rented home with drawn curtains, Linda Thornton was still watching, still waiting, still scheming. And though she no longer owned a piece of Maple Ridge, she wasn't finished with it. Not yet. Months passed quietly after the purchase. The kind of quiet that feels earned, not empty, but peaceful. The war that had consumed Maple Ridge for years had ended, at least on the surface. The gossip slowed, the board meetings returned to dull discussions about landscaping and mailboxes, and for once, the neighborhood felt almost ordinary. Daniel's property now stretched across 3 adjoining lots. From the front, it looked like one continuous estate. Clean lines, open gardens, soft lighting. The boundary that had once divided the homes was gone, replaced by a seamless expanse of green and stone that led toward the edge of the ridge. And that view, the same view that had started everything, was breathtaking. The valley below shimmered with morning mist, the hills rolled endlessly, and when the sunsets came, they painted the sky in gold and fire. For most people, it would have been the perfect ending. But Maple Ridge wasn't built for perfect endings. Rumors about Linda's disappearance had turned into theories. Some said she'd moved out of state. Others whispered that she'd gone bankrupt, her investments drained from years of lawsuits and control. But Daniel knew better. He'd seen her car once, late at night, parked across from the gate, lights off, just sitting there. Watching. She hadn't left. She'd just gone quiet, and that silence worried him more than all her complaints combined. Still, life had to move forward. The renovations on the newly acquired house began immediately. Daniel didn't demolish it. Instead, he restored it, cleaned, painted, repurposed. What was once a symbol of hostility became a guest house, a space for visiting friends and family. He transformed the upstairs balcony, Linda's infamous view, blocking deck, into an open, air-reading lounge with glass railings, so the horizon stretched unobstructed. It was poetic, almost cleansing, the kind of transformation that turns bitterness into something beautiful. The community noticed. For the first time in years, the HOA newsletter featured Daniel's property not as a problem, but as an example of modern design done right. The same board that had once fined him for trivialities now praised his contributions to the neighborhood's image. And yet, in every bit of praise, there was an echo of irony. Because none of it would have existed. The gardens, the decks, the view. Without Linda Thornton's relentless obsession. She had built the wall that started it all. And by tearing it down, Daniel had built everything she tried to stop. But karma has a strange way of finishing stories. Late one autumn afternoon, Daniel received a letter. Not an email, not a typed notice. A handwritten envelope slipped under the gate. The handwriting was sharp, familiar. Linda's. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No threats, no accusations, just a brief message, neat, almost ceremonial. She wrote that she had sold the last of her investments, that she was leaving the state for good. She mentioned that she'd watched his progress, seen how he'd turned her mistake into something admired. And then, at the very end, she wrote one last sentence, a strange, almost haunting acknowledgement. I built walls. You know signature. No return address. For a long time, Daniel just stood there, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. It wasn't an apology. Linda Thornton didn't apologize. But it was something else. A surrender, perhaps. Or an admission that she'd finally understood what she had destroyed trying to control. He placed the note in a drawer and never spoke of it again. The following week, a moving truck appeared near the edge of town. A few neighbors saw Linda for the last time, a lone figure standing beside her car, wearing dark glasses, watching the hills one final time before driving away. No one ever heard from her again. Maple Ridge slowly began to heal. The HOA shifted leadership, younger families moved in, and the community softened. The old culture of control gave way to something quieter, kinder. The petty feuds faded, the endless letters stopped, and people began to speak to one another like neighbors again. And as for Daniel, his life became the opposite of what it once was: steady, creative, content. He opened his gardens for charity events every summer, inviting artists, musicians, and local groups to use the space. What had started as an act of rebellion had become a symbol of unity. On the anniversary of buying Linda's house, Daniel stood on the upper deck, the one that had once blocked his view, and watched the horizon. The sunset burned deep orange over the valley, the same way it had the night she first built that wall. Only now, there was no barrier, no shadow, no bitterness. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees, and the faint hum of peace. He thought about everything that had happened. The walls, the hearings, the inspections, the letters, the whispers. It was strange how something so small, a blocked view, had changed the lives of an entire community. How one person's obsession had built chaos, and another's patience had built beauty. And in that quiet, he realized something. The story had never been about revenge. It had been about reclaiming space. Not just physical space, but emotional space. The right to live without fear of control, without the weight of someone else's rules dictating your joy. He looked out across the valley one last time that evening. The sky deepened into twilight. The lights from the nearby town began to sparkle in the distance. And as the final rays of sunlight slipped behind the ridge, the view stretched endlessly, open, infinite, and his.